Don't talk. Not a word. His voice was ice, his grip crushing her wrist as she cried out. In the doorway, the maid froze, every rule of her life telling her to stay silent, to vanish into the shadows. But what she saw next made silence impossible. A billionaire's rage, a wife's desperate plea, and a poor maid forced to choose between obedience and defiance. This is the untold story of a maid who risked everything to save her powerful boss's wife. Welcome, story lovers. From Where Are You Watching? Hit the like button and drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. The mansion stood like a monument to wealth on the far side of the city, its iron gates tall and unyielding, its driveways stretching like rivers of polished stone, and its windows gleaming like mirrors that caught the sun. To the outside world, it was a symbol of success. People slowed their cars just to stare. Newspapers occasionally featured it in glossy spreads about the lives of the elite. But for Aisha, the woman who stepped through those gates each morning with her head slightly bowed, it was simply her workplace. The truth was harsher. For Aisha, the mansion was not a palace, but a reminder of everything life had denied her. Behind those marble walls she worked, cleaned and scrubbed until her hands were raw. She was one of those people who made the luxury possible, the unseen, unacknowledged, and often unwanted presence that kept the machinery of wealth running smoothly. Her story did not begin in the mansion, though. It began in a small, weathered village hours away from the city where the soil was dry and cracked and dreams often withered before they bloomed. Aisha had grown up in a one-room mud house with a leaking roof and a mother who never let hardship steal her dignity. Her father had been a laborer, strong in body but broken by debts that chained him to wealthy landowners. He died young, his back bent and his lungs weakened, leaving behind nothing but sorrow and unpaid bills. Her mother, Halima, carried the weight of survival on thin shoulders. She taught Aisha that even when the world looked down on them, they could not allow their spirits to break. "We are poor," she would say, "but we are not worthless. Never forget that." As a child, Aisha's dream was simple. She wanted to be a teacher. She imagined standing in front of a blackboard, chalk in hand, teaching children how to read and write, helping them dream beyond the dusty lanes of their village. But reality cut dreams short. School fees became impossible. Food was more important than books. Aisha left school after primary classes and started working, first in nearby farms, then in the homes of wealthier families in the village. Her skin was darker than many, and she remembered the sting of taunts from lighter-skinned villagers who considered her less. Racism had never been a distant concept. It was her daily reality. People assumed she was less intelligent, less capable, less deserving, simply because of her complexion and poverty. Every insult lodged itself in her memory, each one a reminder of the invisible chains society wrapped around her. By her 20s, Aisha made the hard decision to leave her village for the city. There was nothing left for her in the fields of her childhood. The city, she was told, had opportunities, but opportunities for people like her always came dressed in rags. Domestic work was the only option, and she took it without complaint. The day she first walked into the White family mansion, she was stunned. She had never seen ceilings so high or walls that glittered with imported chandeliers. She had never stood on carpets that sank beneath her feet like clouds or touched kitchen counters made of stone so polished she could see her reflection in them. It felt like walking into another world. The family she worked for were billionaires. Jonathan White, a powerful investor known for his ruthlessness, and his wife, Isabella, the glamorous socialite who appeared in charity galas and glossy magazines. To outsiders, they were the picture of perfection, a power couple admired, envied, and discussed in hushed tones. But perfection was only what they showed the world. Aisha learned quickly that the house was a place of rules, rules that did not need to be spoken because they were woven into the air. She was to rise before dawn, prepare the kitchen, set the breakfast table, clean the endless rooms, and ensure not a speck of dust lingered. She was to move quietly, always present, but never noticed. When she entered a room, she became invisible. When she was spoken to, her replies were expected to be short, polite, and respectful. Her voice carried no weight. The hardest part of her job was not the endless work. It was the silence. She could not laugh too loud, speak too freely, or even hum while she cleaned. Some guests looked at her as if she were furniture, others as if she were dirt. The subtle comments, the glances that lingered too long on her skin, the way some people pulled away when she served them tea, each moment was a reminder that she was not seen as equal. But Aisha endured. She had her reasons. Every month, she sent money back to her mother, ensuring Halima did not go hungry. That thought kept her strong. She told herself she was not there to be liked, but to survive, yet survival did not erase the ache in her heart. The first whisper of unease came one morning while she polished the study's shelves. The Whites thought she wasn't listening, but Aisha heard everything. Jonathan's voice was sharp, almost cruel. Isabella's was soft, almost pleading. Aisha caught fragments. Betrayal. Money missing. How could you? Before silence fell, she dusted quietly, pretending her ears were deaf, but her heart thumped. Later that evening, something unusual happened. Isabella approached, her eyes glistening in a way Aisha had never seen before. The mistress who usually gave orders with clipped words and distant smiles suddenly softened. She thanked Aisha for her work and, in an uncharacteristic gesture, pressed a ring into her hand. It was simple compared to the dazzling jewels Isabella usually wore, but Aisha froze. The design was familiar. Too familiar. It looked almost identical to the ring her own mother once owned, a ring that had been stolen years ago during unrest in their village. Aisha stared at it, her throat dry. How could Isabella have this? Was it the same one, or just a coincidence? That night, Aisha lay awake in her small servants' quarters, staring at the ring. She remembered her mother's tears the day it was taken, the way she had whispered that the ring was more than gold. It was family history, a piece of dignity. And now, decades later, it had reappeared in her hands through a woman who barely acknowledged her humanity. The thought haunted her as, weeks passed, Aisha continued her routine. She cleaned, cooked, polished, and remained unseen. But her eyes began to notice more. Jonathan's temper grew more unpredictable. Isabella, though stunning in public, seemed hollow at home, her smiles brittle. Guests came often, politicians, businessmen, celebrities, and many treated Aisha with contempt. Some ignored her, others mocked her accent or her presence. Every insult carved into her soul, but she bore it in silence. Yet silence did not mean blindness. Aisha saw everything. The forced smiles between husband and wife, the tension that thickened the air during dinners, the fear in Isabella's eyes when Jonathan's voice rose. She often wondered why Isabella stayed. Was it love? Fear? Or the suffocating weight of reputation? Whatever it was, Aisha sensed that beneath the mansion's glittering surface, something dangerous was waiting to erupt, and one evening, it did. Long after most of the household had gone to sleep, Aisha walked past the grand hall carrying a tray of folded linens. She froze when she heard voices inside, Jonathan's, sharp and angry, and Isabella's, trembling. Against her better judgment, she lingered by the wall, listening. She couldn't catch every word, but what she heard was enough. Accusations, threats, a secret so heavy it could shatter reputations and destroy lives. Isabella pleaded. Jonathan's tone turned darker. And then, silence. The kind that carried danger within it. Aisha pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. She knew she shouldn't be there. knew she was risking everything by overhearing, but she couldn't pull herself away. That was the moment she realized the mansion wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a storm waiting to break, and she, whether she wanted it or not, was standing in its center. The ring, the whispers, the cruel glances, the unspoken rules of silence, it was all connected. And soon, she would learn that her invisibility was both her curse and her unexpected weapon. Because when the storm finally erupted, when betrayal and danger collided, the poor maid who had been told all her life to stay quiet would be forced to make a choice, and that choice would not only save a life, but reveal truths that had been buried for years. Isha did not know it yet. But the mansion that treated her as less than human would one day depend on her voice, the same voice they had spent years trying to silence. The days that followed the whispered argument in the grand hall felt different, though the mansion itself looked unchanged. The windows still gleamed, the gardens still stretched endlessly, and the family still presented its polished image to the world. But for Aisha, each room carried a heaviness she could no longer ignore. Something unseen lingered in the air, and though she tried to bury herself in work, her instincts whispered danger was growing. Her mornings began as they always had. She would wake before dawn in her cramped quarters, her thin mattress pressing against her bones, the smell of dampness clinging to the walls. She would wash quickly, tie her scarf, and make her way to the main house. By the time the sun began its climb, she had already swept the kitchen, set the table for breakfast, and begun her endless chores. But beneath the rhythm of routine, her mind was restless. She thought about the ring often, the one Isabella had pressed into her hand with unusual gentleness. Each time she looked at it, memories of her mother flooded back. She remembered the way Halima used to polish the heirloom ring, whispering that it carried the strength of generations past. Losing it had been like losing a part of their family's soul, and now here it was again, resurfaced in the hands of the wealthy, like so many other pieces of life the poor had been stripped of. How had it gotten here? Was Isabella even aware of its origin? Or was it just another possession passed down through the careless hands of the powerful? These questions gnawed at Aisha, but they were not the only ones. The overheard argument continued to echo in her mind. Jonathan's voice, sharp with anger. Isabella's, trembling with fear. She had not heard the full story, but she had heard enough to know that something dark lay beneath their polished facade. And soon, the cracks widened. One morning, while clearing the remnants of breakfast, she noticed Isabella staring absently at her cup of tea. The woman's usually flawless composure seemed fractured. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the napkin on her lap. Jonathan, on the other hand, barked orders and read his newspaper, dismissing his wife's silence as though it meant nothing. Later, when Aisha entered Isabella's room to tidy up, she found her sitting on the edge of the bed, head bowed, tears streaking her cheeks. For a moment, Aisha froze. She knew her place. Maids were not meant to comfort mistresses. They were meant to clean quietly, to disappear when emotions ran high. Yet in that instant, she felt the weight of shared womanhood. Pain recognized pain. Before she could retreat, Isabella spoke softly, her voice broken. "Don't tell anyone what you saw." Aisha lowered her gaze, nodding. She never spoke of it again, but the memory stayed. Isabella was trapped in ways Aisha couldn't fully understand, and Jonathan, he was the trap. The guests who visited the mansion added fuel to the fire of unease. They came in polished cars, dressed in tailored suits and glittering gowns, their laughter echoing through the halls. To them, Aisha was invisible. Yet their words pierced her ears. Some made casual remarks about people like her, their tone dripping with superiority. One man, a politician, even joked at dinner. "Jonathan, It's good you keep such loyal help. These people need firm handling, otherwise they grow lazy. The room had erupted in laughter except for Isabella, who had shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Aisha, standing in the corner with her tray, had forced her face into blankness. Inside, rage burned, but rage had no place in survival, so she swallowed it. Again. The racism was subtle sometimes, brutal at others. A guest once asked if she could read, assuming she couldn't. Another complained that the food smelled too ethnic when Aisha prepared a dish with spices from her village. Even Jonathan himself occasionally used words that reduced her existence. To a stereotype, each insult reminded her she was tolerated, not respected. She was useful, not valued. She was present, yet unseen. Still, she worked. Because behind every insult, behind every long day of silence, there was her mother waiting in the village, her survival tied to every coin Aisha earned. But fate has a way of testing even the strongest resolve. One night, Aisha was called to deliver wine to Jonathan's private study. The room was dim, the smell of cigars heavy in the air. Jonathan was on the phone, pacing, his voice low but laced with fury. Aisha set the bottle down quietly, but his words reached her ears. "You think she can expose me?" "No, she wouldn't dare. If she tries, she'll regret it." The hairs on Aisha's arms rose. She knew he wasn't talking about business rivals. His tone was too personal, too venomous. She slipped out quickly, her heart hammering. Whatever. Secret bound Jonathan and Isabella together, it was dangerous, deadly even. The days that followed confirmed her fears. Jonathan grew harsher, his temper exploding over the smallest mistakes. Once, when Aisha accidentally dropped a glass, he sneered, "Do you people ever learn? Always clumsy, always useless." His words cut deeper than the shards of glass that nicked her fingers. She wanted to scream, to remind him that she was human, not you people. But she held her tongue. Isabella, meanwhile, grew more fragile. She avoided her husband's gaze, spent long hours locked in her room, and often stared at the ring she had given Aisha, as if she regretted letting it go. Sometimes, Aisha caught her looking at her with eyes that seemed to plead for something unspoken. Trust? Understanding? Maybe even help. Then came the night everything changed. A lavish party was hosted in the mansion, the kind that made headlines. The halls glittered with lights, music filled the air, and guests moved like peacocks displaying their wealth. Aisha and the other. Staff worked tirelessly, carrying trays, refilling glasses, cleaning messes before they even appeared. As she moved through the crowd, she overheard conversations dripping with entitlement. One guest complained about immigrants ruining the city. Another laughed about how maids should be grateful they're even employed. Each word was a dagger, but Aisha kept her face blank, her back straight. Then, near the staircase, she froze. Jonathan was speaking to a man she didn't recognize, his tone sharp, urgent. The stranger leaned in, his voice low, but Aisha caught fragments. "She knows. Can't stay silent forever. Deal with it." Her blood ran cold. He was talking about Isabella. There was no doubt now. The secret she carried was dangerous enough that Jonathan was considering silencing her permanently. That night, as the party wound down and the mansion grew quiet, Aisha found herself unable to sleep. She paced her small room, the weight of what she had heard pressing down on her. She thought of Isabella's trembling hands, her tear-streaked face, her pleading eyes. She thought of Jonathan's rage, his threats, his cruelty, and then she thought of the ring. It was no coincidence. That ring had been stolen from her family, just as Isabella's dignity was being stolen by her husband. Different women, different worlds, but the same pattern of theft and silence. For the first time in her life, Aisha felt something shift inside her. She had always been told to stay quiet, to endure, to survive. But what if survival now meant speaking out? What if silence was no longer protection, but a weapon Jonathan could use to destroy Isabella and perhaps even her? The climax of her fears came days later. Late one evening, while delivering laundry to Isabella's room, Aisha heard muffled sobs. She paused, then slowly pushed the door open. Isabella sat on the floor, her gown torn, bruises forming on her arms. She looked up at Aisha with eyes full of despair. "Don't talk," she whispered urgently, her voice hoarse. "Please, don't tell anyone." The plea was familiar. It was the same request she had made weeks ago. But this time, Aisha saw more than fear in her eyes. She saw resignation, the look of a woman who believed no one could save her. And in that moment, Aisha knew. Silence was no longer an option. What she had witnessed was not just a broken marriage. It was a dangerous secret, one that could cost Isabella her life. Jonathan was not simply a cruel man. He was a man willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The poor maid who had spent her life invisible was now holding the weight of a truth too heavy to carry alone. But to speak was to risk everything, her job, her safety, even her life. To stay silent was to allow injustice to triumph. The storm had finally broken, and Aisha was caught at its heart. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the walls and made every breath feel heavier. Aisha lay on her small cot, staring at the cracked ceiling of her quarters, unable to sleep. Her mind replayed Isabella's bruised arms, her broken whispers, and Jonathan's venomous threats. She knew danger was near. She felt it in her bones, and then it happened. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the quiet night. Aisha bolted upright, heart pounding, her instincts screaming. The noise had come from the main house. For a moment, fear rooted her in place. Servants were not meant to interfere. She had been told countless times, "Don't speak, don't question, don't involve yourself." But something in that sound, the raw violence of it, pulled her to her feet. Barefoot, she rushed across the courtyard and slipped through the side entrance of the mansion. The halls were dim, shadows stretching long under the pale moonlight that poured through tall windows. She moved quickly, quietly, until she reached the source of the noise, the master bedroom. The door was ajar, and inside, chaos reigned. Jonathan's voice roared like thunder, filled with rage. Isabella cowered near the bed, her gown torn, her face streaked with tears. A shattered vase lay scattered across the floor, fragments glittering like sharp stars. Jonathan's hand was raised, trembling not with weakness but with fury. Aisha froze, breath caught in her throat. She had always known Jonathan was cruel. But seeing him like this, towering over his wife, ready to strike again, shook her to her core. For a split second, she considered retreating, pretending she had seen nothing. After all, she was just the maid. Who was she to step between a billionaire and his wife? But then Jonathan spoke, and the words stripped away her hesitation. "You think you can ruin me?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think anyone will believe you over me? You're nothing without this house, without me. If you dare open your mouth, Isabella, you'll regret it." Isabella sobbed, quietly, clutching her arms as though trying to make herself disappear, and that was when Jonathan moved closer, his hand gripping her wrist with such force that Isabella cried out in pain. Something inside Aisha snapped. She could no longer be silent. She could no longer be invisible. All her life she had been told to endure, to stay in the shadows, to accept her place. But in that moment, watching another woman, another human, be reduced to nothing, she realized that silence was its own form of violence. Before she even knew what she was doing, She stepped into the room. "Stop!" The word tore from her throat, sharp and trembling. Jonathan's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing. For a second, disbelief flashed across his face. The maid had spoken. The maid had dared to interrupt. "What did you say?" His voice dripped with menace. Aisha's knees trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Let her go!" The room seemed to freeze. Isabella's sobs quieted, her wide eyes darting between her husband and the maid who had just broken the unspoken rule of the house. "Don't talk." Jonathan released Isabella's wrist, but only to take a step toward Aisha. His towering figure loomed, his presence suffocating. He sneered, his words like knives. "And who are you to command me? You're nothing. You're just the help. Do you think anyone cares what you see? What you say? People like you have no voice." His words struck deep, echoing every insult. She had endured since childhood, people like you, worthless, invisible. But tonight something had changed. Aisha lifted her chin, her voice steadier now. "Maybe people don't care about me. Maybe I'm just the maid. But I see you, and I know what you've done. And one day, the world will know too." For the first time, Jonathan's confident mask cracked. Rage twisted his features, and in a flash, he lunged toward her. His hand gripped her arm with crushing force, his face inches from hers. "You think anyone will believe you?" he hissed. "You're a poor woman, a nobody. If you speak, I'll destroy you. I'll make sure you and your family suffer." Fear shot through her veins, but she refused to look away. For once, she did not bow her head. For once, she refused to be invisible. Behind them, Isabella suddenly found her voice. "Jonathan, stop!" she cried, her tone sharper than Aisha had ever heard. She rose to her feet, trembling but resolute. "You can't do this anymore." Jonathan's grip faltered. His head snapped toward his wife, his anger redirected. And in that moment of distraction, Aisha pulled free, stumbling back. Her arm throbbed where his fingers had dug into her flesh, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. The room spiraled into chaos. Jonathan shouted, Isabella screamed back, and Aisha stood frozen, torn between fleeing for her life or staying to bear witness. Her heart thundered in her chest, but deep inside she knew, if she ran now, Isabella might not survive the night. So she stayed. Every cruel word Jonathan hurled at his wife only strengthened Aisha's resolve. Every threat reminded her why she could no longer remain silent. She thought of her mother, of the stolen ring, of every insult she had swallowed since childhood. She thought of all the times she had been told to endure quietly, and she realized endurance without resistance only feeds injustice. The climax came when Jonathan raised his hand again, this time with a glint of metal in it. From the nightstand, he had grabbed a letter opener, sharp, cold, dangerous. His eyes blazed with fury as he advanced on Isabella. Aisha's breath caught. This was no longer anger. This was violence that could end a life. Without thinking, she lunged forward, placing herself between Jonathan and Isabella. Her hands shook, her body trembled, but her voice rang out, "You'll have to go through me first." The room went dead silent. Jonathan stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. The maid, the poor, dark-skinned, invisible maid, was standing in defiance, her body shielding his wife. Isabella gasped behind her, whispering Aisha's name like a prayer. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was suffocating. The air felt charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jonathan's knuckles whitened around the letter opener, his rage battling against his shock, and then, with a roar, he hurled it across the room. The blade clattered harmlessly against the far wall, but the sound echoed like a gunshot. Jonathan's chest heaved, his face red with fury. "Get out!" he spat at Aisha. Get out before I forget myself! Aisha did not move. She held her ground, her voice low but steady. No, not until you leave her alone. It was the boldest thing she had ever said. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration. For the first time, Jonathan looked uncertain. Isabella, emboldened by Aisha's defiance, stepped forward too. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. This ends tonight. The power in the room shifted. Jonathan, though still furious, seemed to realize that the walls were closing in. He stormed past them, slamming the door behind him. The echo rattled through the mansion, and just like that, the storm passed, at least for the night. Aisha's legs buckled, and she sank to the floor, her chest heaving. Isabella dropped beside her, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Thank you, thank you," over and over. The poor maid had done the unthinkable. She had broken the silence, risked everything, and saved her billionaire mistress from the man who was supposed to protect her. But as she sat there, holding Isabella's trembling hand, Aisha knew this was only the beginning. Jonathan would not forget her defiance, and the cost of her courage had yet to be paid. Dear audience, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. The house felt different the next morning, heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened the night before. Aisha rose early, her body aching, her arm still marked with Jonathan's grip. She moved quietly through the halls, but every step carried a new weight. Servants glanced at her, their eyes wide with silent questions. They had heard the shouting. They had heard Isabella's sobs. But none dared ask. None dared speak. In this mansion, silence was its own currency, and survival meant never knowing too much. But Aisha knew. She could still see Jonathan's face, twisted with rage, his hand clutching the letter opener. She could still feel Isabella trembling behind her, clinging to her presence as if she were a shield. And she knew, deep in her bones, that what had happened was not finished. Jonathan would not forget. Men like him never forgot defiance, especially not from someone they considered beneath them. When Isabella finally emerged from her room that morning, her face was pale, her eyes ringed with shadows. She walked slowly, almost carefully, as if afraid of being seen. But when her gaze met Aisha's across the hall, something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, fear, and a fragile thread of solidarity. Isabella whispered later that day when no one was around. "You shouldn't have stayed last night. He'll come after you." Aisha shook her head. Her voice was steady, even if her heart wasn't. "If I hadn't stayed, he might have killed you." Isabella's lips trembled, but no words came. Instead, she simply reached for Aisha's hand, holding it for a brief, desperate moment. In that touch, Aisha felt the weight of a woman trapped by wealth, status, and a husband's cruelty. For once, mistress and maid were equals, two women bound by fear and survival, but Jonathan wasted no time in reminding them of the balance of power. By evening, whispers began to spread through the mansion. The butler delivered the message coldly. Jonathan was displeased with Aisha's interference. She was to remain in the servants' quarters unless called. Her tasks were reassigned, her presence limited. It was a punishment disguised as order, a reminder that she was still nothing but the help. Yet, in the punishment, there was also fear. Jonathan did not dismiss her immediately. He did not throw her out onto the streets. That hesitation revealed something he would never admit, that her presence, her words, had unsettled him. He wanted her gone, but he could not decide how without, drawing unwanted attention. Still, the atmosphere grew sharper, crueler. Isabella was watched more closely, her every move shadowed. Aisha felt the invisible net tightening around them both, and yet something inside her had shifted. She was no longer just enduring. She was watching, remembering, waiting. Every insult, every moment of cruelty, she carried them not as wounds, but as evidence. One evening, as the household dined in silence, Jonathan's gaze locked on Aisha when she entered to clear the table. His voice was deceptively calm. The help should remember their place. The words cut through the room, sharp and deliberate. Servants lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear. Isabella froze, her fork trembling in her hand. But Aisha did not respond. She kept her head bowed, her steps measured, yet her silence was no longer submission. It was defiance of another kind. She would not give him the satisfaction of fear, but fear lived inside her still. At night, in her small quarters, she lay awake listening for footsteps, for the sound of the door creaking open. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind, set her heart racing. She knew Jonathan was capable of anything. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Isabella changed. The woman who once cowered in silence began to speak more firmly. She asked Jonathan questions at dinner. She lingered longer in the garden, even when his watchful eyes followed her. And sometimes, when no one else was around, she spoke freely with Aisha, her voice trembling but growing stronger. "You gave me courage," she confessed one night. Her words hushed. "I was drowning for so long, but when you stood between us, I realized I wasn't as powerless as he wanted me to believe." Aisha listened, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She had not expected to inspire courage in anyone. She had simply done what she could not bear not to do. But Isabella's awakening was proof that even the smallest act of resistance could spark change. Still, Jonathan was not a man to be underestimated. His anger simmered beneath the surface, and every so often it erupted in bursts of cruelty, sharp words, slammed doors, veiled threats. He never raised the letter opener again, but the memory of that night hung between them all like a shadow that refused to leave. For Aisha, the impact went beyond the mansion. She began to see her own life differently. The stolen ring her mother once owned, the years of silence she had endured, the countless ways she had been told she was less than human. None of it defined her. What defined her was the moment she said, "No." The moment she chose to stand tall, even when her knees shook. The mansion was still gilded and grand, but beneath its polished surface, the truth had cracked open. Jonathan was no longer untouchable. Isabella was no longer voiceless, and Aisha was no longer invisible. But the question lingered. How long could this fragile shift last before Jonathan struck back in a way neither woman could survive? The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of silence and defiance. Jonathan's presence loomed over every corner of the mansion, but something about him had shifted. His confidence was cracked, his certainty fractured. He still barked orders, still threw his weight around, but behind his eyes lived a flicker of unease he could not mask. And Aisha noticed. For the first time, she realized that power was not only in money or status, it was also in truth, in the courage to stand against cruelty. Jonathan had wealth, he had influence, but he no longer had total control. A single act of resistance had shaken the foundation of his world. Still, survival was not simple. There were nights when Aisha feared she had gone too far, that Jonathan would find a way to ruin her life, to destroy her family back home. But in those moments, she reminded herself of Isabella's voice, trembling but strong. "This ends tonight." Isabella changed more with each passing day. She began to move differently, her shoulders straighter, her eyes less clouded by fear. She started reading again, spending hours in the library instead of locked away in her room. She wrote letters, whether to friends, to lawyers, or to herself. Aisha did not know. But she was no longer drowning in silence. One evening, as they sat together in the dim glow of a single lamp, Isabella whispered, "You saved me, Aisha. Not just that night. You've shown me I don't have to be silent anymore." Aisha felt the words settle in her chest like a warm ember. She had never been anyone's savior. She had never been more than the maid. And yet, in a house where silence had been the rule, she had become a voice. But the world outside the mansion remained unchanged. The city still turned a blind eye to the quiet suffering behind wealthy doors. The system still favored men like Jonathan, men whose cruelty was hidden behind polished smiles and thick wallets. And people like Aisha were still invisible, expected to serve, to endure, to never speak. That truth gnawed at her. She thought often of her mother, of the stolen ring that had once symbolized dignity. She thought of the countless women like Isabella, trapped by appearances and fear. And she realized that her story was not just hers. It was part of a larger one written by injustice, racism, and silence. The final straw came one afternoon when Jonathan, perhaps in a fit of desperation, attempted to reassert his dominance. He cornered Aisha in the hallway, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You're just a servant. You don't matter. People like you will always be beneath me." His words, sharp as ever, might once have cut her to the core. But now, Aisha met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe people like me are invisible to you," she said softly. "But we're not beneath you. Not anymore." For a fleeting moment, Jonathan faltered. And in that hesitation, Aisha knew she had already won, not by defeating him in wealth or power, but by refusing to let his words define her. Isabella soon made her move. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was steady and deliberate. She began contacting people she trusted. She began documenting what she had endured, and slowly she carved out a path toward freedom. Jonathan raged, of course, but the more he shouted, the more his mask slipped, and the more Isabella stood firm. The mansion, once a prison of silence, became a battleground of truth. And though the fight was far from over, one thing was clear: Aisha's courage had lit the spark. In the end, Aisha remained a maid. She did not become rich, she did not suddenly rise above her station. But she gained something far greater: dignity, voice, and the knowledge that she had changed the course of another woman's life. And that perhaps was the truest form of power. The story of that night lingered in whispers among the servants, in the quiet strength of Isabella's new resolve, and in the silent fear that haunted Jonathan's eyes. It was proof that even the most powerless among us can rewrite the rules, that even in the darkest corners, courage can break through. For the audience listening now, the message is clear. Injustice thrives on silence. Racism, abuse, cruelty, they grow stronger when ignored, when endured quietly. But one voice, one act of defiance, can spark change that ripples far beyond the moment. Aisha did not end racism. She did not end cruelty. But she proved that silence is not the only option. And in a world where so many are told to stay quiet, that truth is revolutionary. So tonight, as this story comes to a close, ask yourself, when faced with injustice, will you remain silent or will you speak? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.